Third slide. Yep. Yeah, so this is our contact information. If you guys have any questions or if you want to reach out and want to know more about Mendix or about the session today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Fumi or Victoria.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, Nidhi. So if we go to the next slide, in order to bring this workshop to life, we wanted to use a use case to demonstrate Mendix's functionality. And we also wanted to walk you through how to actually create basic features of an app using Mendix. So for today, the role that we're going to be playing is Jimmy, who's the director of the Learn Now company. And in the current state, Jimmy uses just Excel to manage his training courses that the company offers. So the issue that he's seeing is that as the company is continuing to grow, it's becoming more and more difficult to actually track all these courses. And Jimmy's looking to future-proof his company and wants to build an app to keep track of it all. So the solution that we're going to dive into today is actually creating an app with Mendix. And he wants to create an app to be able to do the following. So easily register new participants, easily enter new courses into the system, and then also provide trainers the ability to see an overview of when they need to teach each class. So I'm going to pass it on to Fumi, who will be showing how to build the actual app, and we'll be showcasing one aspect of it.
All right, so I guess when we start building the app, the first thing that we're going to do is to create a layout grid. And this is essentially a widget that gives structure to the different pages in your app. So a layout grid will contain rows and columns, and you can add content to your pages by adding different kinds of widgets. So widgets are elements that can be used to do a variety of things, such as display text, aggregate data, as well as trigger microflows using buttons. And we'll talk a little bit more about microflows later, but you can essentially add multiple widgets to a container in order to provide more consistent spacing and alignment. And so our app is going to need 4 buttons, one for courses, one for locations, one for teachers, and one for trainees. So the question is, how can we build our app to reflect this? So I'm going to play a short video and it'll show you the beginning of how we can start building our app.
When you start a new project in Mendix Studio, what you'll notice is you're going to end up with a screen that looks something like this. Now, going back to our example about wanting to have separate pages for courses, teachers, trainees, as well as locations, we want to be able to reflect that. So one thing that we can start by doing is by going over to the toolbox over here. Now what you'll notice is we already have one column over here, but ideally we want to have 4 since we have 4 separate pages that we want to go into. So all we need to do is add columns by clicking this button over here. Now that we have 4 columns, we can easily see that we can have one for each of the various categories. The next thing that we're going to want to do is go back to the toolbox and search for the card action tool. So the idea behind this is these will create cards and we can do different things with them. So I'm just going to drag and drop a card action tool into each of these. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename them. Now going back to our former example, we wanted to make sure that we had separate pages for things like courses. We wanted one for location, one for trainers, and then one for trainees. When you start a new project in Mendix, so we have our 4 card action cards over here, but when you click it, absolutely nothing happens. And this is because we haven't told it what to do yet. So in our scenario, ideally, when we click one of these buttons, it will bring us to a separate page that has a list of courses, locations, trainers, and trainees. Unfortunately, we haven't actually created these pages yet. So what we need to do right now is create a new page. To create new pages, you just have to go to the Pages button, click the plus sign, and since we want to create a list, let's go ahead to the list. description. We're then going to rename it. Let's call this one Courses Overview and hit create. Now, once again, you can just edit the title and you've already created a new page. You can also go back to your pages and see that we still have our home page that we had originally, as well as this new page over here. Going back to the home page, now we want to be able to link our home page to our courses page. And this is where we're going to create something called a button. To create a button, hover over the button over here. And what you're going to see on the right is something called an on-click action. So what that means is when a user clicks that portion, we're directing the app to perform or act in a certain way. So in our case, if we click page, we want the user to be able to click the button and be redirected to a different page. In this case, we want them to be redirected to courses. All right, so hypothetically now the user should be able to click this button and go to the courses overview. So we have our
So what you'll notice is at the top right corner, you'll notice it says checks, and you'll notice that there's a little red circle over here. So we can see that there's a message saying that there's no entity configured for the data source and that we need to select an entity or to change the data source. So we have an error over here and now we need to solve it. So I'm going to pass it over to Victoria, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how to fix this.
Awesome, thanks, Fumi. So the next piece that I wanted to dive into is the domain model. So as Fumi mentioned, we do see some errors, and this is because we've created pages and we've linked them using buttons, but we need to actually fill the pages with actual data now. So if we look into this basic principle of the difference between an entity and an attribute, in this diagram, the blue rectangles seen in this screenshot are entities. So to actually show data in the app, you need to connect a list view to an entity. So an example of an entity in the app we're creating is a course, for example. And then the second piece is an attribute, and an attribute determines what kind of information is actually seen. So examples of attributes related to the course entity are title, so title of the course, duration of the course, price, and then also description. And it's important to note that attributes also have data types. So an example of a data type is decimal, Boolean, binary, string, etc. So if we flip to the next slide, this page is the course overview page. And what we want to do now is to actually display dynamic data on the page. So what we've done here is change the title and the subtitle so it reflects what this page will be used for, and also so users know what they will expect to see when they go on this page. So if we select the list view of this course overview page, we want to connect this to an entity. So if we go to the right side under properties, if we select entity, what we want to do is create an entity within the project. We're going to name this entity course. And as you can see here, the text in this list view will now be replaced by the different attributes of the course entity. So this list view is connected to the course entity. And what we want to do is add different attributes. So the attributes that we want are a course title, a description, the duration of the course, and the price of the course. So what we'll do here is click the list item title text. We want to replace this with something that's more dynamic, which will be the attributes that we're going to add. So we're going to click this add button and add an attribute, and we're going to create an attribute within the course. So we're going to name this title, and we're going to make it type string. And if we create, this will allow the title of the courses to dynamically populate here. In the secondary text section, we want to delete this and replace it also with an attribute. Another attribute that we can create is description. And then we can also keep this as a string. And we're going to populate this. With This page is the course overview page, and what we want to do now. So what I'm going to do is just add in the rest of the attributes for the course entity. So I've just added in description as shown before, and I'm going to add in the duration of the course. So I'm going to add an attribute called duration. We likely want this to be a decimal, so it can capture any hours and minutes of the course. And I'm also going to add in an attribute called price to show the price of the class. And this could be decimal as well. And with these attributes, what we can see is that they will dynamically populate. So once we add in the course, we will be able to see what the description of the course is, the duration of the course, and also the price of the course. Awesome. So I'm just going to jump into the structure of the domain model. So what we see here is that we have all the different entities laid out as well as the attributes that are associated with each entity. And the line that is seen between the two entities is called an association. So in a domain model in Mendix, the various entities need to be connected together so that they can interact with one another. In Mendix, there are three main types of associations. So there's one-to-many, one-to-one, and then many-to-many, also known as reference set. So if we look at this domain model, we see that there's a one-to-many relationship between the training event entity and the course entity. If we flip to the next slide, there'll just be another demo. What we can do is also add a new entity directly in the domain model. So if we open up the domain model on this page and we select my first module, this is where we can see the entities that we've just created. So we just created the course entity. Just for demo purposes, I could create another entity. So for example, the location entity. And the location entity will just be another page in the app that can be created. And then if we create the location entity, we can also add in the attributes. So we can add in the name of the location, which would be a string. We could also add in the address, which is also a string. And for demo purposes, I'm also going to create an entity called training event. So I can just showcase how the association also works. So for the training event, we can create an attribute called start date. And then this one will be date and time. And then we can also create one called end date as another attribute in this entity that is also date and time. What we want to do now is actually create an association between these entities. So this training event entity needs to have a connection to the course entity and also to the location entity, for example. So in the system, you can store what the course will be and also where it will be hosted and, for example, who will be teaching it. A training event will always be for only one course and one location hosted by one teacher. So this is an association that needs to be created. So if we select the arrow button next to new attribute here, we can connect training event to course. And then the association you'll notice is called training event underscore course. So the naming convention is generally entity one underscore entity two. We can also create an association with the training event entity and the location entity, and the association will be called training event underscore location. And this is how we can create the relationships between the entities in the domain model. The last piece I just wanted to quickly touch on is creating something called detail pages. So up until now, we've built pages that allow Jimmy to see information in the system. So he'd be able to see, for example, the course overview page, but we haven't created any pages yet where he can actually add or edit information. So I'm just going to quickly demo how to create a detailed page for each overview page. We've built a page so Jimmy can actually see the information in his system. So now the next step is to actually create pages where he can add or edit information called a detail page. So Jimmy can therefore actually add information to the app, which he can then see on this page. So what we want to do is actually create a button on this page, which will then connect to a detail page. So we're going to go to the toolbox, add in a button, and we're going to connect it to the course entity. We're also going to name this button add, and also in the property section, just give it a different style so it stands out more. We then want to connect it to a page, and the page that we want to create hasn't been created yet, so we're going to hit this plus button to add a new page called course new edit. We're going to select the form vertical and also select the pop-out layout, which is essentially allow the detail page to open on top of the overview page as a pop-up window. And we actually see a checkbox here that says pre-fill page contents based on the course entity. And this is exactly what we want. So if we hit create, we will see that we now have a detail page that has all the attributes of the course entity linked on it. And this is what we want to see because essentially this page will be used to input information, which will then populate onto the course overview page.
So now I'm going to go back and talk a little bit more about microflows, which we mentioned earlier in the presentation. So microflows are able to add logic to your application and they can help with automation. And it typically contains the following: events, which represent the start and end points of a microflow, flows that form connections between events, activities which do things such as create or delete objects, show messages, etc., decisions to help make choices and merge different paths, as well as artifacts which can provide the microflow with input and allow you to make comments. So let's say we want to create a microflow that helps us schedule training events using a pre-existing course. So in our current state, you would have to click New in order to create a new training event. But in our target state, we want to be able to pick a course from a pre-existing course, such as Mendix 101. And then the goal is to be able to create training events using the data from the pre-existing course, using the same title as well as the duration. So how do we do this? We can break it down into 3 easy steps. Step 1 is to create a button on the course that is clickable and shows the end user that they need to click a button to schedule the course. Step 2 is that after clicking the button, they create a new training event. And step 3, after the new training event is created, we want to be shown the training event page. Now that we understand exactly what we're trying to accomplish, let's put this into practice. So going back to step 1, we wanted to be able to create a button that would trigger the microflow. So to do this, we're going to go back to our toolbox and select a widget. Now I'm going to use a different widget this time called Call a Microflow, which will specifically allow a user to click on it and then trigger a microflow. So in order to make it more user-friendly, I'm going to give it a slightly more informative caption, such as schedule, so that they know that by clicking this, they can schedule an event. And I'm also going to dress it up a little bit by adding things like an icon, such as the calendar. And I'll also play around a little bit with the style so that it pops out a little bit more. Now, at its current state, if a user were to click this, nothing would happen. And this is because it's not actually connected or calling a microflow. So to do that, we first need to select a microflow. And since we haven't created anything yet, let's go ahead and create a new one. Let's just call it Create New Training Event. Now that we've created it, we're brought to our first microflow page, where we have a start point, an end point, and it'll then be drawing data from the course. If you want to go back to your pages, you can always go back here. And if you want to see all of your microflows, you can just click this button over here.
Now that we've finished step 1, step 2 indicates that by clicking the button, we should be able to create a new training event. So to do this, I'm going to go back to the toolbox and select the Create Object Activity and drag it into my Microflow. You'll then need to select an entity to create. In our case, we want to be able to select Training Event because our goal is to create a new training event. And in our example, you'll also remember that the goal of the Microflow is to create the training event using a pre-existing course name, for example, Mendix 101. So we need to tell the Microflow that the training course name that they use should correspond to a course name that already exists. And we can do this by setting an initial value. So the training event course name should correspond to the existing course. We're now done with step 2 and on to step 3, where what we want to do is bring up and show a page of the different training courses that have been scheduled. So to do this, we're going to go back to the toolbox and use the Show Page activity and drag it in. Once again, we now need to specify what page this brings us to. So in our case, we want to be able to bring it to the new training events that are being scheduled. We're also needing to specify an object to pass, and in this case, we're going to choose our training event since this is the information that we want to see passed on to the page that we're about to open. And just like this, you've created your first Microflow. You can then preview your app by clicking the preview button. And what we're going to do is we're going to test it out to make sure that everything is working the way we want. So let's go back to our courses and back to step 1, where step 1 was making sure to click the button. For example, let's click Mendix 201 and let's schedule that. It's a 2-day course, so let's say we want it scheduled for the 29th and then it'll end on the 31st, and let's click save. Now, if we were to go back to our training event, we can now see that Mendix 201 has been scheduled from the 29th to the 31st without needing to click this button over here. Now that we've
And that's how you create a basic app. I'm going to hand it over where we'll be able to see a demonstration of a different type of app. Oh, and we've also included some resources here, such as an installation guide for if you'd like to download Mendix for yourself, as well as a few different learning paths with resources and videos that you can watch if you want to learn a little bit more about how you can develop your own app.
Thank you, Fumi. So guys, what we're going to do now is quickly go over one of the apps which we developed recently to do some recruitment tracking. Let me know when you guys can see the screen.
We can see it.
Okay, perfect. So the purpose of this application was twofold. First, to create job postings. So whenever Deloitte has a new opening, anybody from inside the Deloitte recruitment team can create a June job posting, which would have all the details. And then secondly, whoever applies to that, you're able to track them and see their application all the way through. So that basically includes assigning screeners to them, making sure that they're getting their interview scheduled. And then of course, at the very end, know whether somebody has been sent an offer, if they've rejected or not. So that's essentially, that was the whole goal of it. So in our demo today, we'll look at two different things that we can do. First and foremost, so if we go to manage candidates, so this is an example of one of the pages that Fumi and Victoria were talking about. Here we have the ability to add a new candidate where we can go and pretty much add all the details that we want for a specific candidate. And because we have created a candidate entity in our domain model, we should be able to save all that information of a specific client and be able to view it once we have created it. And we can also, of course, add attachments to it, such things like resume, cover letter. And then the other thing we will look at quickly would be a job posting. So let's just say if you're creating a new job posting, let's call it posting reference ABCD, and then we say BTAs fall 2022. We add a service line, which would be systems engineering. Posting date is today. Screening date starts from tomorrow. It ends the day after. Same goes for round 1 interviews. It starts the day after on the 28th. And then we go for round 2 interviews, then round 3. And then the posting would be, if we say the deadline for the posting is 30th, we might get an error. Yeah. So it says the deadline cannot be before the interview, before the round 2 interviews end. So that's a validation. That's something we'll go over right now. And this is something you guys can achieve using a microflow. So I'm going to set 31st, just a day after the second round of interviews are done. So now we have created another job posting. So on the front end, any specific job posting would be able to apply, and we will be able to see all their information attached to the specific application. Now let's see what's happening on the back end. Let me share my Mendix. Just bear with me. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So this is an example of how a properly fleshed out domain model would look like. So what we saw on the front end, here what we have done is everything that we think requires its own entity or something which we would have more than one records of, we would create an entity for, and then we'll associate them together. So for example, we have a candidate, because you would have more than one candidate applying for a position, so we need a separate entity for that. And then attributes would be all the little details that would need for that candidate to sync. So things like first name, etc. And we go for postings, because there would be more than one posting. And then both of these things would be combined into a candidate application, because a candidate would have their details and they would be applying for a specific job posting. And then you can see there's an interview schedule entity. So everybody who is selected for something would be scheduled for an interview. So that's why we have this entity. And now if you look at associations, so as Jimmy and Victoria talked about it, and depending on what kind of, how you want these entities to interact with one another, the association could be different. So for example, every candidate can only have one resume and one cover letter. So you can see it's a one-to-one association. Now every posting, so candidate application and posting has one-to-many association, which means every candidate application would be attached to only one posting, but more than one people can apply for the same posting. So that's why there's a many on that end and one on this end. So similarly, depending on what you want to do, you would have to select your association, and this has a big impact on how you're using memory in the backend. So in the longer run, when you have over 1 million records or something, how you're selecting your associations really goes a long way. Now, if you look at our homepage, which is what we were looking at on the front end, this is what a layout looks like essentially. So if we go to, for example, manage candidates and click on page. By the way, when you guys install Mendix, yours might look slightly different because I'm running a slightly older version of Mendix, but you should be running 9.13, and all the installation instructions are in the app, in the deck. So here you see this, what I have right now is a grid data view. So what I've done is I have basically associated this grid view. So everything that's happening with a specific candidate, I've double clicked on it and I have attached to a specific entity, which is called candidate, which is what we created. So whenever we open this page from the front end, all the candidates that are attached to this specific application would show up right here. And if I want to create a new candidate, I'll click on, 1 second, sorry. Yeah, so when I want to create a new candidate, I'm attaching a microflow to this button that would trigger the logic. Now we can go through a quick example of a microflow. So if we go to job postings, which is what we created, we have this button here to which we attached a microflow. Actually, let's go to this one. Yeah. So once we enter all these details, which we saw on the front end, service line, start date, screening start date, ended, etc. When you click on save, that's when you have a microflow getting triggered, which is where the logic building would happen, because everything that has to do with different UI components can be done on a page, but everything that has to do with any kind of action being done to display something or to save something. All of those actions are done through a microflow. So when I click on it, there are different actions that are being done. So in this one, the first and foremost thing that we need to do is a validation, just to make sure that all the data are entered properly. There is no duplicates, no start date is entered before the end date, etc. So here we have a quick example of a microflow where all we have done is we have taken different components of a microflow, which is what Amy and Victoria showed us. So activities, decisions, and based on that, we have created this thing. So for example, if the job reference ID is not empty, then great, go to the next step and validate that. But if it is empty, then you show a validation message asking the user to enter it properly. So that's the good thing with Mendix. You don't have to worry too much about coding these dialog boxes and error messages and everything, because most of that is taken care of for you. All you have to do is think of the flow and just develop that. So this was a quick example. And another quick tip that I would give you guys would be to make sure you break down everything and keep it separately into separate folders, because as you go and as your application gets more and more elaborate, you would have a lot of these different microflows and pages and everything. So the more you separate them out and keep them in a separate folder, the easier it is to manage. So I think that was a quick overview of Mendix and how it works. Back to you, Jimmy.
Thank you, Salman. Thank you, Fumi. Thank you, Victoria. And yeah, I mean, that's about it. Any questions from the group? If not, I can hand it back to the hackathon team.
Sorry, I think there was one question in the chat. And the question was, what would you say is the real impact / benefit of having low code and no code applications?
I can take that.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Nidhi.
No, I was just going to say, can you take that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So for the reason why you should use or you can use low code, no code is it really depends on what you're trying to develop. So for example, if you're trying to set up a website which would display the menu of a restaurant and be able to take all the reservations for it, it's a fairly simple application or website that you need, and you don't require to go through the exhaustive process of developing everything from scratch, right? You don't want to build different UI components and everything, which for somebody who is not really a developer or doesn't have a technical background, it could take them forever. So that's where Mendix steps in. It's a fairly quick thing, as you saw through some of the demos and examples. Most of the UI components are taken care of. Like the UI coloring, everything can be done just by clicking, by mouse clicks and using drop-down menus. All you got to do is just focus on the flows, how something's going to go, what's going to be shown first, what's going to be shown after. So essentially, you can set up a website or any simple application within hours or days, depending on how complex you want to make it. So I say just it saves you time, and it sort of takes away the limitation of being technical. Even if you're not technical, as long as you know the flow of your product, you'll be able to develop an application. Nidhi, feel free to add something to it if you want.
I think you explained it well, Salman. Did that answer the question? Whoever asked it, I hope so.
I